There is a name that appears again and again in the crisis dispatches of the Third Reich's final 3 years. Not at the beginning, when the victories came easily and the generals were celebrated in newsreels, but at the worst moments, when entire army groups were dissolving, when the front had broken beyond repair, when every other commander had either failed or run out of answers. The name is always the same. Send Model. He wasn't sent to win wars. By the time he arrived anywhere, winning was no longer the question. He was sent to stop collapses, to hold lines that had no business holding, to buy days out of situations that should have cost weeks, and weeks out of situations that should have ended in catastrophe. And almost every single time, he delivered. He came from nowhere that mattered. No military dynasty, no Junker estate, no family connection to the officer corps that had dominated the Prussian army for generations. His father was a music teacher in a provincial Saxon town, and yet Walter Model rose through 2 world wars and decades of institutional friction to become a Generalfeldmarschall, the highest military rank in Nazi Germany, commanding not 1 but 2 separate army groups simultaneously at the peak of his career. He stopped the British at Arnhem. He stabilized Army Group Center after one of the worst military disasters in modern history. He held the Western Front longer than anyone thought possible. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, they all had opinions about this man, and none of those opinions were dismissive. But rank and result are only part of this story. The other part lives in the documents he couldn't burn. The orders, the after-action reports, the testimonies of the soldiers who served under him, and the civilians who suffered under the armies he commanded. Walter Model was not a simple man, and this is not a simple history. It is the story of one of the most technically accomplished commanders of the entire Second World War, operating inside one of the most destructive regimes in human history, and what that combination produced, and what it cost. Over the next several hours, that story will unfold. From a schoolroom in Naumburg in 1909 to a forest outside Duisburg in April 1945. Every detail documented, every claim sourced, nothing invented. This is the complete history of Field Marshal Walter Model. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. This channel is built on documented history, primary sources, and the occasional admission that I got something wrong. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Music Teacher's Son. Origins and the First War. Otto Moritz Walter Model was born on the 24th of January, 1891, in Genthin, a modest Saxon town in the orbit of Magdeburg, and the circumstances of his birth matter more to this story than they might seem. His father, Otto Paul Moritz Model, was a music teacher at a local girls' school, not a soldier, not a civil servant of consequence, not a landed gentleman with hunting estates, and a connection to the officer corps. A music teacher. His mother was Marie Pauline Wilhelmine, née de Mer. The family moved first to Erfurt, then to Naumburg. Small towns, provincial trajectories. And Walter graduated from the Dom Gymnasium Naumburg at Easter 1909, a humanities-oriented secondary school that gave him a classical rather than a technical formation. I find this background genuinely interesting because the Prussian officer corps of the early 20th century was still, in meaningful ways, a class institution. The established pathway ran through Junker families, through estates in Pomerania and Brandenburg, through fathers and grandfathers who had already worn the uniform. Model had none of that. What he had instead was an uncle, Martin Model, who served as a reserve officer in the 52nd Infantry Regiment. It was through Martin's influence that Walter joined that regiment as an officer cadet on the 27th of February, 1909, barely weeks after finishing school. He wasn't the natural prodigy. He wasn't top of his class at the officer cadet school in Nice. His contemporaries noted even then that he was not especially sociable, not a man who collected friends easily. What they did notice was ambition, drive, a blunt, almost confrontational directness that made him uncomfortable to be around, but impossible to ignore. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 52nd Infantry Regiment on the 22nd of August, 1910, and by October 1913, he had become the adjutant of the regiment's 1st Battalion, a staff function that suited his organizational mind perfectly. Then August 1914 arrived, and the world changed. The 52nd Infantry Regiment mobilized as part of the 5th Division, which was assigned to the Western Front. In the opening weeks of the war, they saw action at Mons, and then at the First Battle of the Marne in September before the front congealed into the familiar misery of static trench warfare in the Soissons sector. Model was promoted to Oberleutnant, first lieutenant, in February 1915. 3 months later, in May, near Arras, a bullet struck his shoulder blade and sent him to hospital for a month. He returned to the line. In September, he distinguished himself in the fighting around Butte de Tahour and was awarded the Iron Cross, First Class, one of the most recognized decorations in the German military, on the 19th of October. And then, 2 weeks later, artillery fragments hit his right shoulder. Another hospital stay. 6 weeks this time. In April 1916, during the Battle of Verdun, shell fragments tore into his right thigh. 3 wounds in less than a year. That pattern, the front, the hospital, the return, would repeat itself throughout his entire career. Model was not a man who directed battles from a comfortable distance. He was always, instinctively, as close to the fighting as his rank allowed, and sometimes much closer than it should have. His divisional commander noticed, despite what the official record describes as misgivings about this uncomfortable subordinate, he recommended Model for general staff training, which, in the German army of the First World War, was the gateway to everything that mattered. Model completed the abbreviated 8-month staff officers course and returned to the 5th Division as adjutant of the 10th Infantry Brigade. Postings followed, company commander, then a selection in June 1917 by Lieutenant Colonel Georg Wetzel for duty on the Oberste Heeresleitung, the Army General Staff. In late 1917, he was part of a delegation of junior staff officers who accompanied Colonel Hans von Zecht to Constantinople to assess the Ottoman Empire's capacity to continue fighting. Model was promoted to Hauptmann, captain. In March 1918, he was assigned to the staff of the Garde-Ersatz Division as division supply officer and fought in the German spring offensive of that year. Operation Michael in March against the British, the Second Battle of the Marne in July against the French. He was transferred again in August to the 36th Reserve Division and fought with them through the autumn operations. The Battle of the Lys and the Escaut, as the war moved toward its close. What I want you to hold on to from this first chapter is something simple but important. By the time the guns stopped in November 1918, Walter Model was 27 years old, had been wounded 3 times, had served in both frontline command and general staff roles, and had been noticed, genuinely noticed, by senior officers as someone with exceptional capability. He didn't emerge from the First World War as a celebrated hero. There were no headlines with his name. But within the institutional machinery of the German army, the markers were there. The man had started climbing, and he wasn't going to stop. Chapter 2. The Lean Years, Weimar, Reichswehr, and the Patient Student, the German army, crossed back into Germany in November 1918, and what it returned to was not the country it had left. The Kaiser had abdicated. The government had collapsed. There were revolutionary councils in the streets of Berlin and Munich, and the men who had just spent 4 years in the trenches found themselves trying to march through a country that was simultaneously celebrating the armistice and tearing itself apart. Model was given the credit by 36th Reserve Division Commander, Major General Franz von Rantow, for the division reaching Danzig more or less intact in those chaotic weeks. A logistical and command feat that, under the circumstances, was considerably more difficult than it sounds. He thought about leaving the army, seriously considered it. His uncle Martin talked him out of it. In November 1919, the post-war Reichswehr was being shaped by von Sicht. The same man Model had accompanied to Constantinople, and von Sicht selected Model as one of the 4,000 officers permitted under the terms imposed by the Treaty of Versailles to remain in the 100,000-man army. That selection mattered enormously. The Reichswehr of the 1920s was a deliberately compressed institution, a small professional army designed to preserve and transmit the expertise of the imperial military while Germany was formally barred from building the force it wanted. Every officer who made it through was, by design, expected to be worth more than one. Model became adjutant of the Danzig-based XVII Corps from January to June 1919, then joined the staff of the 7th Brigade in Westphalia. In early 1920, he was commanding a company in the 14th Infantry Regiment at Konstanz, which was sent into the Ruhr in March to help suppress the Ruhr uprising, his first direct encounter with political instability and domestic unrest. He kept aloof from it, following von Sicht's lead. The experience left him, according to the biographical record, with a lasting hatred of communism. That's documented. What we can't know is how much of that was visceral conviction and how much was the soldiers' habitual disdain for disorder. Probably both. In May 1921, while billeted in the Ruhr, Model married Herta Heissen. The ceremony took place in Frankfurt on the 11th of that month. They would go on to have 3 children, a daughter, Hella, born in 1923, a son, Hans-Georg, born in 1927, a second daughter, Christa, born in 1929. The marriage, from what the record shows, was stable and affectionate. A private life that Model clearly kept separate from his professional existence with great deliberateness. The burning of his personal papers at the end of his life was not an accident. He was a very private man. The 1920s were a period of serious intellectual work for Model, and I think historians underweight this. In September 1928, he returned to staff duty at 3rd Division headquarters, where he lectured in tactics and war studies. He gave presentations on the First Battle of the Marne and the Battle of Tannenberg. He published a study of August Neidhart von Gneisenau in 1929. Among his students were men who later became senior figures in the Wehrmacht: Adolf Heusinger, Alfred Jodl, Hans Speidel. These weren't abstract historical exercises. Model was thinking hard, in that cramped but intellectually serious Reichswehr culture, about what made armies succeed and what made them fail. In 1930, he was transferred to the training branch of the Truppenamt, effectively the disguised general staff, where he served under colonels who included Wilhelm von List and Walter von Brauchitsch. He became close friends with Friedrich Paulus, a fellow staff officer who would later command the 6th Army at Stalingrad. In August 1931, Model accompanied Brauchitsch, Wilhelm Keitel, and Ernst August Kostring on a visit to Germany's secret training areas in the Soviet Union. He spent 2 weeks with the Red Army's 9th Rifle Division at Rostov and wrote a paper on the Red Army's weapons technology that evidently gave him an early and detailed education in what the Germans might one day face. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in November 1932. By October 1935, Model was appointed head of the 8th Department, Technical, of the Oberkommando des Heeres, the revived Army General Staff. This was the department responsible for the development of new weapons, particularly artillery. He was one of the officers who advocated, in those formative years of German rearmament. For the creation of armored divisions and corps, he was promoted to Major General on the 1st of March, 1938. He led a test firing of the 21-centimeter Mercer 18 against mock Czech fortifications, which did not impress Hitler when he watched. And after General Franz Halder became Chief of Staff of the OKH in September 1938 and conducted a purge of pro-Nazi officers from the headquarters staff, Model was reassigned out of Berlin down to Chief of Staff of the 4th Corps in Dresden. A demotion in all but name. He didn't protest. He adjusted. He kept working. Chapter 3. Poland and France. The staff officer becomes a commander. On the 1st of September 1939, the 4th Corps crossed the border into Poland as part of the 10th Army under General Walter von Reichenau, which itself formed the southern element of Rundstedt's Army Group South. For Model, still serving as 4th Corps Chief of Staff, it was a campaign that lasted 11 days of hard fighting before collapsing into German occupation. The operational picture in Poland was, and I say this carefully, a lesson in the gap between pre-war planning and battlefield reality. The Wehrmacht's performance in Poland was impressive by the metrics of speed and result, but it exposed genuine weaknesses in logistics and inter-arm coordination that would matter enormously later. Model wasn't a divisional commander in Poland. He was watching, calculating, processing. In October 1939, he was appointed Chief of Staff of the 16th Army, on the recommendation of Brauchitsch, now Commander-in-Chief of the Army, and found himself working directly under General Ernst Busch, whose politics were enthusiastically Nazi, but whose tactical thinking was, according to those who served with him, distinctly conservative. Brauchitsch hoped that Model's expertise in fast-moving operations would supplement Busch's caution. What he got was a partnership of mismatched temperaments that somehow produced a functioning headquarters. The plan for the attack on France assigned the 16th Army to a secondary role, covering the left flank for Army Group A, the main effort. Under the original operational plan, this would have been relatively straightforward work, but the adoption of the Manstein Plan, the shift of the main effort through the Ardennes, changed the geometry of the battle entirely, and the 16th Army's frontage became much wider, with a much more urgent demand for rapid movement. Model spent considerable energy in the weeks before the attack overseeing logistical arrangements. The kind of unglamorous but essential work that determines whether a fast-moving army actually keeps moving. The Germans attacked on the 11th of May, 1940. Within days, the speed of the French collapse was outpacing German expectations. The Dial plan that Gamelin had adopted, the forward deployment of the best Allied forces into Belgium, was catastrophically wrong, and the 16th Army's infantry advanced much faster than even optimistic German planning had assumed. By late May, the 16th Army had shifted to a defensive posture, and in June it participated in Case Red, the final phase against France. The 16th Army linked up with the 1st Army on the 22nd of June, encircling more than 600,000 French troops, one of the largest surrenders in military history. Model was promoted to Lieutenant General on the 1st of April, 1940. But something interesting happened in the aftermath of the French victory. When the army distributed its promotions, Busch and his 3 corps commanders were all advanced. But Model was not. He wasn't in the list. After all the staff work, all the logistical coordination, all the operational planning, nothing. He spent the following months working on planning for Operation Sea Lion, the proposed German invasion of Britain that never happened, while junior officers who'd commanded field divisions in France received the decorations and advancement. I've thought about this omission, and I don't think it was coincidental. Model didn't fit. He was abrasive. He challenged his superiors. He wasn't from the right background. he wasn't popular at senior officers' dinners. The German army's promotion culture of 1940 still had strong currents of social conservatism running through it. And a music teacher's son, with no inherited connections and a habit of making people uncomfortable, didn't automatically find the path open. What changed Model's trajectory wasn't any formal recognition of what he'd done in France. What changed it was Russia, and Russia was about to begin. Chapter 4. The 3rd Panzer Division. Model finds his war. In November 1940, Model received his first genuine independent command, the 3rd Panzer Division. He had no background in armoured warfare. None. His career had been infantry and staff. The assignment was engineered by Brauchitsch, who transferred the 3rd Panzer's existing commander to another posting to make way for him. Some of his new officers were skeptical. This was a prestigious division, one of the original armoured formations that had helped define what German armoured warfare could do. And now it was being handed to a man who'd never led tanks before. Model's response was not to pretend he'd always known armoured tactics. His response was to learn and to train. He launched a combined arms training program that, by the standards of late 1940 and early 1941, was genuinely innovative. He threw his men together in ad hoc groupings, regardless of their parent unit. Tankers trained with infantry. Engineers worked alongside reconnaissance units. He was, according to historians who've studied this period, anticipating by several months the standard German use of Kampfgruppen, the all-arms battle groups that would become the Wehrmacht's basic tactical building block on the Eastern Front. At the time, it was unusual. His staff found it untidy. But the men respected it, because Model insisted on knowing every unit, every commander, every condition. He met as many of his soldiers as he could. He was already the officer who walked the front line. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. The 3rd Panzer Division formed the spearhead of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, assigned to Army Group Center. The campaign opened with the speed that everyone in the Wehrmacht had planned for and hoped for, and the 3rd Panzer was in the vanguard of it. By the 4th of July, just 12 days into the campaign, Model's advance elements had reached the Dnieper River, a penetration of roughly 400 kilometers into Soviet territory. Crossing the Dnieper in strength was another matter. The Red Army was prepared to defend the river line, and a prepared river defense is one of the most difficult tactical problems an attacking force can face. Model reorganized his command into 3 groups for the crossing: an infantry heavy force to cross and establish a bridgehead, a mobile armored group to pass through the bridgehead and continue the advance, and a fire support group containing nearly all his artillery. The plan worked. The river crossing came off with minimal casualties, an outcome that, given the circumstances, was close to remarkable. It was the kind of multi-arm coordination that looked simple after the fact, but required weeks of preparation, and a commander who had thought through every contingency. Guderian then turned south, on Hitler's order, to assist with the encirclement of Soviet forces defending Kiev. The maneuver required an unsupported advance of roughly 275 kilometers. Model's 3rd Panzer led the thrust again, pushing from the 24th of August to the 14th of September into the rear of the Soviet southwestern front. The operation concluded when 3rd Panzer made contact with elements of the 16th Panzer Division from Army Group South at Lokwitza, closing the trap around Kiev. When resistance was finally suppressed, more than 665,000 Soviet soldiers had been taken prisoner, the largest encirclement in military history at that point. Model had been part of the force that made it happen. On the 26th of October 1941, Model was placed in command of the ex-Ally Panzer Corps, promoted to General de Panzertruppe, and dropped into the middle of Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow. He arrived at his new command on the 14th of November, in the midst of the battle, and found a corps that was worn out at the end of a long and tenuous supply line, and beginning to contend with temperatures that were dropping toward the limits of human and mechanical endurance. The advance continued anyway. By the 5th of December, the Corps' 6th Panzer Division had reached a point roughly 35 kilometers from the Kremlin, and there the winter stopped them. Chapter 5. Before Moscow and the birth of the Fireman, Rzhev, 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive opened on the 5th of December, 1941, and it came hard. The Kalinin, Western and Southwestern fronts struck simultaneously, and the force directed at Army Group centers' exposed forward elements was enough to push them back from their closest approach to the Soviet capital. The 3rd Panzer Group, which Model's Corps was attached to, had made some of the deepest penetrations and now faced the most dangerous counterattack. In 3 weeks of confused fighting, the group extricated itself and fell back to the Lama River line. Model's Corps was assigned to cover the retreat. What happened in those weeks around the retreat from Moscow was, by the accounts that exist, one of those periods where a commander's essential character is either confirmed or broken. Model was harsh, he was demanding. On several documented occasions, he personally intervened at congested crossroads with a drawn pistol to restore order when panic was threatening to turn a tactical withdrawal into a rout. That's documented. That's in the record. And I think it tells you something about who this man was at his core. Not a distant organizer, but someone who considered himself personally responsible for whatever was happening at the furthest end of his command, and who was physically willing to be there. During this retreat, Model began to think systematically about what was going wrong with German defensive tactics. He noticed that Soviet attacks tended to succeed most consistently when the Germans used a strong point defense, a small number of heavily defended positions with gaps between them. The gaps were the problem, and Soviet logistics, he noted, were still inadequate to sustain a fast-moving exploitation, even when a breakthrough was achieved, which meant that gaps in the German line didn't automatically produce catastrophes if there were mobile reserves to plug them quickly. He ordered his men to spread out into a continuous, thin line, rather than cluster in strong points, combined with centralized artillery and small mechanized Kampfgruppen to deal with any breakthrough. The 6th Panzer Division, by the end of 1941, had been reduced to roughly 1,000 men, including all frontline, support, and staff personnel combined. His tactics were working, but at a brutal cost. In January 1942, Model was placed in command of the 9th Army. He leapfrogged at least 15 more senior commanders in Army Group Center alone to get there. The appointment came directly from Hitler, and the story around it has been repeated in the literature often enough that it carries real weight. Before Model departed for the front, he held consultations with both Hitler and Halder. Hitler was impressed by the vehemence of Model's replies about what would be required to save the army, and reportedly said afterward, "Did you see that eye? I trust that man to do it, but I wouldn't want to serve under him." That quote appears in the historical record. I'm using it because it's documented, not because it makes a tidy scene. When Model arrived at the 9th Army, the Kalinin front had broken through the line and was threatening the Moscow-Smolensk Railway, the main supply artery for Army Group Center. He immediately counterattacked, cutting off the Soviet 39th Army that had penetrated his line. He drafted construction units, supply troops, administrative personnel, anyone who could hold a rifle, and sent them to the front. Through the winter months, he repelled multiple Soviet attempts to relieve their trapped soldiers. On the 31st of January 1942, Model received the oak leaves to the Knight's Cross and promotion to General Oberst. Then, Having stabilized the front, he set about reorganizing the army's defensive doctrine with a thoroughness that went well beyond tactical improvisation. He established up-to-date intelligence from frontline rather than rear area sources. He insisted on a continuous front line, no matter how thinly held. The gap problem, solved with manpower. He created dedicated tactical reserves. He centralized artillery command directly under divisional and corps commanders, rather than dispersing it across regiments. And, critically, he ordered the construction of multiple static defense lines in depth, even though Hitler had explicitly forbidden this, arguing it would tempt soldiers to fall back. Model built them anyway, quietly, knowing the order was wrong. Liddell Hart, the British military theorist and historian, described Model as having the amazing capability to collect a reserve from an almost empty battlefield. That phrase stayed with me when I first read it. It's such a precise observation. Most commanders have reserves because they created them deliberately in advance. Model seemed to locate resources that others hadn't realized existed. Scratch units, exhausted formations, men returning from leave, and assemble them into something coherent under pressure. The Soviet Operation Mars in November 1942, Georgy Zhukov's second great offensive against the Rzhev salient, struck from 4 directions simultaneously, tested everything Model had built. His defensive system held. It cost the Wehrmacht enormous casualties, but it held. The Soviet offensive was contained, and then the spearheads were cut off and destroyed. Model emerged from nearly a full year of fighting around Rzhev with a reputation that had now reached beyond the internal circles of the German army. He had earned the nickname by which history would remember him. Der Feuerwehrmann, Hitler's fireman, the man you sent for when the front was on fire. Chapter 6, Operation Citadel and the Failure that Confirmed Everything. Kursk, 1943. I want to be honest about something before we go into Kursk, which is that this battle is one of those events in the historiography of the Eastern Front where almost everything is contested. Casualty figures, the operational significance of individual decisions, the degree to which outcome was predetermined by Soviet intelligence versus actual tactical performance. The history of Kursk has been revised and re-revised. What I can tell you with confidence is what the documents show about Model's specific role, his specific decisions, and their specific consequences. The German plan, Operation Citadel, called for a double envelopment of the Soviet salient at Kursk. Army Group South would attack from the south under Manstein. Army Group Center's 9th Army, under Model, would attack from the north. The original advocates of the plan, Manstein and Klug among them, had urged that it be launched in May before Soviet fortifications could mature. Model disagreed. He'd done the reconnaissance. He knew what was in front of him. Konstantin Rokossovsky's Central Front was strongly dug in and outnumbered him 2-1 in men, tanks, and artillery. He said the offensive should be postponed until he could receive further reinforcements, specifically the new Panther tanks and Ferdinand tank destroyers. What Model actually hoped to achieve with this delay is something historians have debated. Some read his request for postponement at face value, a professional assessment of insufficient resources. Others, including careful readers of his staff's retrospective accounts, have suggested he actually wanted to see the operation cancelled entirely, and that the demand for postponement was a way of running out the calendar until the Soviets launched their own attack and made Citadel unnecessary. I find the second interpretation persuasive, but I can't prove it. The papers are gone. The offensive opened on the 5th of July, 1943. It was a failure almost immediately in Model's sector. The Red Army had prepared elaborate defensive works in depth, multiple trench lines, interlocking anti-tank gun positions, minefields, concealed armor. Rokossovsky had moreover, correctly anticipated exactly where the German attack would come and had concentrated his strength accordingly. Model, recognizing that an armor-heavy assault would be chewed up in this terrain, had decided to lead with infantry to breach the Soviet line before sending the armor through. It was a logical choice given what he was facing. It didn't work. The Germans took heavy casualties to advance less than 12 kilometers in 7 days and could not break through to open ground. When Model threw his armor into the battle to try to force a decision, it incurred heavy additional losses without achieving a breakthrough. The Red Army's strength in the salient was growing faster than the attacking force could erode it. On the 12th of July, Soviet Operation Kutuzov opened a massive counteroffensive into the Ossel salient, involving not just Rokossovsky's central front, but the Bryansk and western fronts as well. Stavka, the Soviet High Command, expected to reach the city of Orel within 48 hours, splitting the German forces in 3. Instead, the battle lasted 3 weeks. Model had anticipated this possibility. Without OKH's knowledge, he had spent the weeks before Citadel constructing extensive defensive works in the Orel salient to meet exactly this kind of counterattack. Kluch placed Model in command of both 2nd Panzer Army and 9th Army for the defensive battle, a larger combined force than he had commanded during Citadel itself. The Soviet preponderance of strength was enormous. German casualties from the 1st through the 10th of July totaled 21,000 men. From the 11th through the 31st of July, 62,000. Despite those losses, Model conducted an orderly withdrawal from the salient, inflicting comparable casualties on 3 Soviet fronts and preventing the annihilation that Stavka had planned for. Model was relieved of command of the 9th Army at the end of September 1943. Not, the historical consensus suggests, because he'd lost Hitler's confidence, but because Hitler wanted him available when the next crisis arrived. He went on leave to Dresden with his family. It was a short respite. What Kursk confirmed, definitively, and at scale, was that the Wehrmacht could not win a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The industrial and manpower arithmetic had moved irreversibly against Germany. What remained was the question of how long the line could be held, and at what cost. And for that problem, the problem of defending against an opponent with greater resources on multiple collapsing fronts, Hitler was increasingly certain he needed one particular general, the man with the eye, the Fireman. The music teacher's son from Genthin, who built defense lines against orders and argued with the Führer and somehow made the math add up when no one else could. The worst was still ahead of him, and he knew it. Chapter 7. The Army Group North Rescue. Estonia and Shield and Sword, 1944. On the 31st of January 1944, Hitler summoned Model from his leave in Dresden and sent him north. Army Group North had, in the previous 2 weeks, watched the siege of Leningrad, which had lasted 872 days, broken by a coordinated offensive of the Volkhov, Leningrad, and Second Baltic fronts. The 18th Army had been shattered into 3 parts. The front had not bent, it had dissolved. The previous commander, Generalfeldmarschall Georg von Küchler, had spent weeks pleading with OKH for permission to withdraw to the Panther Line in Estonia, a prepared defensive position roughly 150 kilometers to the west, but had been repeatedly refused. Küchler had then taken partial measures, which left him with the worst of both worlds. Too far forward to be safe, too far back from the original line to mount a coherent defense. The result was chaos. Model arrived and immediately changed the language. He introduced a new operational doctrine that he called Schild und Schwert, shield and sword. The concept, as he articulated it to Hitler and OKH, was this. Ground would be temporarily yielded to concentrate reserves, and those reserves would then immediately counterattack to drive the Red Army back and relieve pressure elsewhere on the front. It was, in its framing, aggressive. It spoke of counterattacks and recovery. It did not speak of systematic retreat, and because it sounded assertive rather than defensive, it got through Hitler's pathological refusal to sanction voluntary withdrawals. Whether shield and sword was a genuine operational philosophy or an elaborate piece of institutional theatre designed to disguise what Model actually intended to do, which was withdraw to the Panther Line, is one of those questions the historiography hasn't fully settled. I think it was both simultaneously. Model understood that Hitler had to be managed as well as served, and that the blunt truth, we are withdrawing 200 kilometers and there is no alternative, would produce paralysis or a direct refusal. The wrapped version, the same withdrawal repackaged as aggressive maneuver, could get past the political filter. It's the kind of institutional sophistication that only someone who had spent decades inside the German army's culture would develop. It's also, if I'm honest, a morally complicated act. You're deceiving your supreme commander to save an army group. The deception worked. Whether it should have worked is a different question entirely. Model's immediate practical task was the extrication of the 18th Army, which had been broken into 3 separate pockets by the Soviet offensive. He delegated the Narva front, the most exposed sector, where German and Estonian forces were holding a bridgehead across the river against the Leningrad front, to General Johannes Friesner, commanding Army Detachment Narva. And then, without informing OKH, he began constructing a series of interim defensive lines between the current front and the Panther Line to cushion the retreat and buy time. More secret defense lines. The same thing he'd done at Rzhev and in the Oral Salient. Each line added days to the Soviet advance, time that allowed German units to disengage and move west in reasonable order rather than running. His shield and sword counterattacks, the ones he'd promised Hitler, did launch. They cost between 10,000 and 12,000 additional German casualties. They almost never recaptured the ground they went for. But that wasn't really the point. The point was to keep the Red Army off balance, disrupt its operational rhythm, and prevent it from simply following on the heels of a retreating German force and turning a fighting withdrawal into a collapse. It worked. By the 1st of March 1944, Army Group North had completed its withdrawal to the Panther Line. The forces were mostly intact, battered, depleted, but present and organized. In 58 days, Model had taken a shattered army group, moved it across 150 kilometers of contested winter terrain, and delivered it to a prepared defensive line without losing it. That's the bold operational fact. The shield and sword counterattacks had consumed men who, from any realistic assessment of the war's overall trajectory, couldn't be replaced. The deportations and scorched earth measures that accompanied the withdrawal, the burning of villages, the forced movement of civilian populations were not incidental. They were deliberate policy, documented in the orders, and Model's name is on those orders. I'm not going to smooth past that. The man who saved the Panther Line front and the man who authorized the destruction of Estonian villages are the same person. That's the record. On the 30th of March, 1944, Walter Model was promoted to General Feldmarschall. He was the youngest field marshal in the German army. He had come from a music teacher's household in Genthin and risen to the highest military rank in the Third Reich in 35 years. On the same day he received the promotion, he was transferred again, south, to Army Group North Ukraine. Hitler did not let him rest. The Eastern Front was not going to let anyone rest. Chapter 8. Army Group North Ukraine and the Disaster of Bagration. 1944 Army Group North Ukraine in late March 1944 was not technically in crisis, not compared to what was coming. It was under pressure from Georgy Zhukov's First Ukrainian Front. The Soviets had driven a deep salient into German lines, and the army group was falling back through Galicia. But the front was still coherent, the command structure was intact, and the Germans still had armor and artillery in significant quantities. What Model found was an army group that had been worn down by months of operational strain under Manstein, whose relationship with Hitler had deteriorated past the point of function. Manstein had been a magnificent operational commander, arguably the most gifted the Germans produced. But he and Hitler had stopped being able to work together. Manstein wanted freedom. Hitler wanted obedience. Model, paradoxically, often got more freedom from Hitler than more pliable generals, precisely because he delivered results and had demonstrated a willingness to confront the Führer face to face. There's an exchange from this period that appears in the historical record, and I find it revealing in a very specific way. When Model arrived at Hitler's headquarters to receive his briefing before taking command of Army Group North Ukraine, he walked in and immediately began challenging the situation maps, questioning whether the unit positions marked were current, demanding to know the true combat strength behind each symbol. He was, by multiple accounts, asking Hitler who is in command, me or you, in everything but those exact words. And Hitler, to the astonishment of the other officers present, deferred. He didn't rage. He didn't dismiss Model's questions. He answered them. That dynamic, the one general who could make Hitler back down in a briefing room, defined the next 6 months. Army Group North Ukraine's fighting withdrawal through Galicia continued through April, May, and June. The 1st Panzer Army, using Model's established defensive doctrine, managed to hold the line east of Lvov against Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front through a mixture of prepared lines, concentrated artillery, and aggressive Kampfgruppen employment. It was messy, expensive fighting with no decisive moment and no clean victories. Just the grinding arithmetic of an army holding the line against an opponent with more of everything. Then, on the 28th of June, 1944, a telephone call changed everything. Operation Bagration had opened on the 23rd of June. By the 28th, it was already catastrophically clear that Army Group Center, covering the central sector of the Eastern Front, to the north of Model's command, was being destroyed. Not pushed back, destroyed. The Soviet offensive involved 1,200,000 men across 4 fronts, and it struck Army Group Center on multiple axes simultaneously, using a combination of deep penetrations and encirclements that annihilated entire German corps in days. The 9th Army was shattered. The 4th Army was encircled. The city of Minsk, the Army Group's communications hub, was falling. The scale of the collapse was comparable to the German destruction of Soviet forces in 1941 in reverse. Hitler sent Model north to take command of Army Group Center. He was still technically in command of Army Group North Ukraine. Briefly, uniquely, he held command of 2 separate army groups simultaneously, coordinating their operations, a span of command that no other German field commander ever achieved during the war. He arrived at Army Group Center's headquarters to find a situation that was, by any objective measure, beyond repair. The question was only how much could be salvaged, and at what cost. Model still believed, on arrival, that Minsk could be held, but only if the 4th Army was allowed to break out of its pocket immediately, and if fresh divisions were fed in from army groups north and North Ukraine to counterattack the Soviet penetrations. Hitler refused both requests until it was too late. Minsk fell on the 3rd of July. Model pushed on, attempting to re-establish a front west of the city, using whatever fragments of divisions could be assembled, pulling units from Army Group North and North Ukraine to plug gaps. In early July, his forces recaptured briefly the initiative in one sector. He encircled and destroyed the Soviet 3rd Tank Corps in a large-scale armoured engagement near Radzymin, east of Warsaw. It was precisely the kind of Kampfgruppe-based counterstroke he had been practicing since the winter of 1941. By the 3rd of August, the advance had been halted, a continuous front re-established along the Vistula, and the Soviet summer offensive ground to a stop against reorganized German lines. The human cost of Bagration and its aftermath for Germany is difficult to fully comprehend even now. Army Group Center lost between 300 and 400,000 men in killed, wounded, and captured in the first month of the offensive alone. 28 German divisions were effectively destroyed. The Eastern Front had irrevocably shifted. Model had not stopped Bagration. Nobody could have stopped Bagration. What he had done, again as at Rzhev and at Army Group North, was prevent the follow-on catastrophe, the collapse after the collapse that would have opened the road to East Prussia and the Baltic coast months earlier than it eventually came. Whether that prolongation of the war was, morally speaking, worth the additional lives it consumed on all sides, is a question that historians, and I think anyone who cares about this period, has to sit with. Chapter 9, The Western Front, Falaise, Paris, and the ruins of Army Group B. On the 17th of August, 1944, Hitler awarded Model the Diamonds to the Knight's Cross, the highest decoration in the German military, and simultaneously transferred him to the Western Front. Two things at once, recognition and another emergency. Model replaced General Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge as Commander-in-Chief West and Commander of Army Group B. Kluge was being recalled to Berlin to answer charges relating to the failed assassination attempt against Hitler on the 20th of July. He killed himself en route. Model, arriving in France, was walking into an institution in free fall. The context was this. The Allied breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, had succeeded in late July. The US Third Army under General George Patton was driving for the Seine at speed. An entire German army group was in danger of being encircled in what the subsequent history would call the Falaise Pocket, a catastrophic tightening trap involving the US. First Army from the west, Canadian and British forces from the north, and the US Third Army swinging around the south. The German 7th Army and Panzer Group Eberbach were inside the pocket. Model's first order, which stunned his staff, was that Falaise be defended. They thought he'd lost his mind, but he reversed course almost immediately and convinced Hitler to authorize the immediate breakout of the forces inside the pocket. Something Kluge, with his compromised political position in the wake of the July plot, had not had the standing to push through. The result was that a significant proportion of the German 7th Army escaped. On foot, mostly, without heavy equipment, but alive and in sufficient numbers to fight again. The cost was nearly all their armor, artillery, and transport. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were captured, but the core of the force survived. Model, as with so many of his operations, had extracted something usable from a situation that had threatened to be a total loss. Then Hitler demanded that Paris be held. Model's response to this order, and it's documented, was that yes, he could hold Paris, but only if given an additional 200,000 men and several panzer divisions. Some historians call that naive. Some call it tactical bargaining, a way of making the demand transparently impossible without the career risks of simply refusing. I read it as both. Model knew perfectly well that 200,000 men weren't available. He also knew that framing his refusal as a conditional capability statement, rather than an outright disobedience, was the only way to get Hitler to accept it without replacing him. Paris was liberated on the 25th of August. What Model found as he tried to rebuild Army Group B in late August and early September was an army group that was not simply damaged, but conceptually unraveling. The units that had escaped Falaise were disorganized. Morale was badly shaken. Supply lines were broken. Replacement equipment wasn't coming in anything like the quantities needed. He established his headquarters at Oosterbeek, near Arnhem in the Netherlands, because the rear areas in Belgium were already being overrun by the Allied advance. He worked 18-hour days. His staff noted that he demanded more of them now than at any previous point in his command. Inspecting units personally, driving forward to check positions, sacking commanders who failed to meet his standards. Several senior officers resigned rather than serve under him. The one thing working in Model's favour in those weeks was Allied logistics. The pace of the Allied advance from Normandy had been extraordinary, but supply lines were stretched to breaking point. The port of Antwerp had been captured intact on the 4th of September, but the Scheldt estuary, the waterway that would allow Allied ships to use it, remained in German hands. That bottleneck bought Model weeks of time that he used with characteristic intensity. He reinforced the Albert Canal line, scraped together armoured reserves, and began the painstaking work of rebuilding a coherent front out of the fragments of an army that had just suffered one of its worst defeats in the war. He didn't have long to consolidate. On the 17th of September, while eating lunch at his headquarters in Oosterbeek, he heard the sound of aircraft overhead and went outside to find the sky filled with parachutes. Chapter 10, Arnhem, the bridge, the intelligence failure, and the Allied I have to be careful about how I describe what happened at Arnhem, because it's one of those battles where the subsequent legend, the heroism of the British 1st Airborne Division, the phrase, "a bridge too far," the film, has accumulated so many layers over the actual operational history that separating them requires real effort. Model himself was astonished. His first assumption, standing outside his headquarters at Oosterbeek, looking up at thousands of British paratroopers descending from the sky, was that they had come for him specifically, that this was a targeted operation to capture the commander of Army Group B. The scale of what he was seeing disabused him of that idea within minutes. But the initial reaction tells you something about how completely the operation had surprised him. Operation Market Garden, the Allied plan, launched on the 17th of September 1944, was Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's ambitious attempt to cross the Rhine by seizing a series of bridges over the Maas, Waal, and Lower Rhine rivers in the Netherlands. The operation used 3 airborne divisions, the US 82nd and 101st, dropped at Nijmegen and Eindhoven respectively, while the British 1st Airborne Division dropped at Arnhem. The furthest north, the final bridge, the one the ground forces had to reach last. Allied intelligence had failed to identify the presence of the IIS's Panzer Corps, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, refitting in the Arnhem area after Normandy, as a significant threat. Model immediately ordered the IS Panzer Corps into action. The Corps, commanded by SS Obergruppenführer Willy Bittrich, was seriously understrength after Normandy. Both divisions were at a fraction of their full complement, but they were composed of veterans. Against lightly armed paratroopers with limited artillery and no armour, even understrength SS Panzer divisions were lethal. The 9th SS Panzer Division moved on Arnhem, engaging the British paratroopers who had managed to reach the northern end of the bridge. Only 1 battalion of the division's 3, the rest having been slowed by German reaction forces on the drop zones. The 10th SS Panzer Division moved south to Nijmegen to hold the bridge there against the American 82nd Airborne. Here's where something interesting happened. A decision that military historians have argued about ever since. Model forbade Bittrich from blowing up the Nijmegen Bridge. The tactical logic was this. Model believed that the situation offered not just a defensive problem to manage, but an offensive opportunity. If he could hold the bridges at Nijmegen and destroy the Allied corridor that XX Corps was advancing along, He might be able to cut off and destroy the entire airborne force. Keeping the Nijmegen Bridge intact was part of that counterattacking concept. It turned out to be a mistake. The Americans eventually seized the bridge intact, and XXX Corps crossed it. But the reasoning wasn't irrational. It was model thinking offensively, as he always had, even when the strategic situation demanded caution. The British at Arnhem held the north end of the road bridge for 9 days with one reinforced battalion. They were not relieved. XXX Corps, pushing north from the south, could not break through the German corridor defences fast enough. On the 25th of September, the survivors of the British 1st Airborne Division, approximately 2,400 men out of roughly 10,000 who had dropped, were evacuated across the Rhine at night. The bridge had not been taken. The Rhine crossing had not been achieved. Operation Market Garden, the Allied plan to end the war by Christmas of 1944, had failed. Model is regarded by most serious operational historians as having fought an outstanding defensive battle at Arnhem, better than at almost any previous point in his career. The speed of his reaction on the 17th of September, the clarity with which he identified the enemy's objective and organized a response, the coordination of IS Panzer Corps and the ground forces holding the corridor, all of it demonstrated a commander operating at the peak of his abilities. The Allied defeat at Arnhem was not primarily a product of German tactical genius. It was also a product of Allied intelligence failures and logistical overextension, but Model exploited those failures with a precision that deserved the result he got. After Arnhem, Model turned to the Hurtgen Forest, where US Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group was pressing toward the Roa River. The fighting in the Hurtgen, from September through December 1944, was some of the most costly combat the US Army experienced in the entire European theatre. The forest, with its dense conifer growth, broken terrain, and prepared German fortifications built into the west wall. The Siegfried Line neutralized Allied advantages in air power and armor. The US First Army suffered at least 33,000 killed and incapacitated, against German losses of at least 28,000. Aachen fell on the 22nd of October at high cost. The Roa River Dam stayed in German hands. Model had stopped the Allied autumn offensive cold. The victory was real. So was the arithmetic behind it. Germany was running out of everything: men, fuel, tanks, aircraft. Model knew it. What he didn't yet know was that Hitler was about to order one final, enormous gamble. Chapter 11. The Bulge. This plan hasn't got a damned leg to stand on. There's a particular kind of tension that develops when a military commander is ordered to execute an operation he believes is wrong by a superior he can no longer refuse, for objectives he doesn't think are achievable. Model sat in that position in the autumn of 1944 with absolute clarity about his situation. The Wehrmacht had just won defensively at Arnhem, in the Hurtgen Forest and along the Aachen Line. It was fighting well given its resources. Model believed those resources, the armor, the fuel, the infantry divisions, should be used to thicken the defensive line and make the Allied advance into Germany as costly as possible. That was the kind of war Germany could still fight, not the kind Hitler had in mind. Hitler's plan, which Model received in detail in mid-October, called for a massive armoured offensive through the Ardennes in Belgium and Luxembourg. The same terrain, almost exactly, through which Army Group A had driven in 1940. The objective was Antwerp. The concept was to split the Allied armies, isolate the British 21st Army Group, and create a political and military crisis, severe enough to force a separate peace with the Western Allies. It was, in its ambition, reminiscent of the summer of 1941 thinking. The belief that a single decisive blow could reset a war whose arithmetic was running against Germany on every front simultaneously. Model's documented reaction to the plan was blunt even by his standards. In front of his staff and in formal exchanges with O'Cage, he said, "This plan hasn't got a damned leg to stand on. That's in the record." He and Generalfeldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, now back as Commander-in-Chief West, developed a joint alternative, which they called the Small Solution. Instead of driving for Antwerp, their proposal was a more limited operation to pinch off the Allied salient around Aachen. A counterattack that aimed not at strategic reversal, but at inflicting a tactical defeat, significant enough to disrupt Allied planning for the spring campaign. Less dramatic, much more achievable. Hitler rejected it entirely. For the operation, eventually executed as Operation Herbstnebel, beginning on the 16th of December 1944, Model had at his disposal the 6th SS Panzer Army under SS Obergruppenführer Josef Dietrich in the north, the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel in the center, and the 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger in the south. Across all three armies, more than 2,000 panzers and assault guns, more than 2,000 aircraft. In German terms at this stage of the war, an extraordinary concentration of the last strategic reserve. Model threw himself into the operational planning, despite his disagreement with the objective, which was characteristic of him. Disagreement never meant half measures in execution. The initial results were, briefly, better than many Allied commanders had expected. German forces achieved tactical surprise in the opening days, advancing through the Ardennes in fog and snow that kept Allied air power on the ground. Certain US divisions, particularly those newly arrived in the sector, were overwhelmed and taken prisoner in large numbers in the first 2 days. Model recognized early, however, that the 6th Panzer Army in the north, the formation Hitler had loaded with the most armor because it contained his favored SS divisions, was getting bogged down against stiffer than expected American resistance. The penetrations were coming through Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army in the center. Model began shifting the operational focus accordingly. The advance stalled before the Meuse, the town of Bastogne, a critical road junction in the Ardennes, held against the German 7th Army, resupplied by Allied airdrops once the weather cleared on the 23rd of December. The same weather that cleared for resupply brought Allied tactical air power back over the battlefield in force, and the German armoured columns, already constrained by their supply situation. Fuel had been a critical uncertainty from the first day, lost much of their remaining freedom of movement. The bulge was contained. And then, from the first week of January 1945, steadily compressed by Allied counterattack. I've read Model's post-operation assessments, and what strikes me is the total absence of self-deception in them. He knew exactly why the offensive had failed. Insufficient fuel, Allied air superiority once the weather cleared, and, fundamentally, a strategic concept that exceeded Germany's actual resources by a margin that no amount of operational skill could bridge. He'd said it before the operation started. The battle confirmed it. Rundstedt, when asked after the war what had been the turning point in the Western campaign, reportedly said it was the moment the 6th Panzer Army failed to break through on the first day. Model, I think, would have said, the plan was wrong before the first day. When a staff officer complained to Model during the bulge about equipment shortages, he snapped, "If you need anything, take it from the Americans." That exchange is documented. It tells you everything about where Model was psychologically in those December weeks. Driven, caustic, still operationally aggressive, still projecting confidence to his men, even as the inner calculus had long since settled against any realistic hope. That gap between what he projected and what he knew is, to me, one of the most human things in this entire story. He was a professional soldier, performing his function at the absolute end of what that function could achieve. And the worst was still 1 month away. Chapter 12, The Rhine, the Last River, and the Last Argument. By February 1945, the Western Front had contracted to the Rhine. The river had been a psychological as much as a geographical barrier in German strategic thinking. The idea that if the Allies could be held on the West Bank, some negotiated conclusion to the war in the West might still be possible, some fraction of Germany's national territory preserved. It was an idea that required Germany to hold the Rhine crossings against an Allied force that now had overwhelming air superiority, unlimited logistical depth, and a manpower advantage that widened every week. Model knew the numbers. His army group intelligence summaries were not the fantasy documents that some German headquarters were producing by early 1945. They were blunt, accurate, and grim. What Model had, going into February, was the West Wall, the Siegfried Line, still partially intact east of the Belgian and Dutch border. He had the Hurtgen Forest and the Roer River as additional barriers to the north. He had, on paper, Army Group B consisting of the 5th Panzer Army under Manteuffel, the 15th Army, and several independent corps. What he actually had was a fraction of those paper strengths. Divisions that should have contained 10,000 men contained 2,000. Armoured units that should have fielded dozens of tanks fielded a handful, often immobilized by fuel shortages. The Luftwaffe that was supposed to cover the front was flying only a fraction of its theoretical sorties. He requested, repeatedly and in increasingly direct language, that OKW release the forces being held in Army Group H to his north, to strengthen the Rhine line. The requests were refused or answered with partial measures. The crossing that broke everything came not where the Germans expected it. On the 7th of March, 1945, soldiers of the US 9th Armored Division reached the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen and found it still standing, damaged but passable. An American platoon crossed it, then a company, then, within hours, an entire regiment. The Rhine, which the German High Command had treated as the ultimate barrier, had been crossed by chance and seized by junior American officers acting faster than any senior headquarters could process it. Hitler sacked the commanders responsible. He also tried to destroy the bridge after the fact, using artillery, naval frogmen, and early jet aircraft in a frantic series of attempts over the next 10 days. None of them worked. The bridge eventually collapsed on the 17th of March from structural damage. But by that point, the Americans had already built their own pontoon bridges, and the bridgehead on the east bank held more than 25,000 men. Model's response to Remagen was to counterattack, to try to collapse the bridgehead before it could be expanded. He assembled everything he could reach: tank destroyers, infantry, artillery, elements of the 11th Panzer Division. But there was never enough concentrated force to do what the terrain required. The bridgehead perimeter was being expanded faster than German counterattacks could compress it. In the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was preparing his formal set-piece Rhine crossing, Operation Plunder, for the 23rd of March, supported by the largest Allied airborne operation in the European theatre, Operation Varsity, which put 2 airborne divisions across the river in a single morning. The Rhine line was gone. What followed in the last week of March was a pursuit rather than a battle. The US 9th Army broke out of the Remagen bridgehead on the 25th of March, driving northeast and east at a speed that German infantry, moving on foot or in horse-drawn carts, couldn't hope to match. The 1st Army followed. Patton's 3rd Army had crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim before Plunder even launched, almost casually, with minimal resistance. Army Group B was being outflanked on both sides. Model attempted to establish new lines at rivers and road networks, east of the Rhine. Each line held for a day or two before being bypassed. The speed of collapse now exceeded even Model's capacity to adapt. He was using his command skills to manage a fighting retreat rather than execute a defense. And every hour the room was smaller. Then, on Easter Sunday, the 1st of April, 1945, the US 9th and 1st Armies linked up near Lippstadt, east of the Ruhr. The trap closed. More than 325,000 German soldiers, the entirety of Army Group B, were encircled in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers from north to south and 120 kilometers from east to west, including the major industrial cities of Dortmund, Essen, Dusseldorf, and Duisburg, including most of Germany's remaining Western industrial capacity. Model was inside. He had no way out and no realistic way to break through. Chapter 13. The Ruhr Pocket. 3 weeks. 300,000 men. I want to be precise about the Ruhr Pocket, because it's a battle that rarely receives the sustained attention it deserves in popular histories of the Second World War. It tends to appear as a footnote between the Rhine crossing and the German surrender, a brief chapter of mopping up before the war ends. It wasn't that. For the men inside that pocket, German soldiers, Volkssturm conscripts, Hitler youth boys, civilian workers, families. Those 3 weeks were some of the most horrifying of the entire war in the West. And for Model, they were the period in which every professional skill he had ever developed collided with a military situation that was, at last, genuinely beyond any possible remedy. The initial German strength inside the pocket. 325,000 men as a rough count, though the precise figure remains contested in the secondary literature, sounded formidable. It wasn't. The combat effectiveness of the formations was a fraction of what their nominal strength implied. Ammunition was critically short. Fuel was almost gone, which meant armoured vehicles were largely immobilized. Food was being rationed within days of the pocket's formation, as the supply depots inside were overrun or destroyed by Allied bombing. The Ruhr's road and rail network, which had been targeted by the Allied strategic bombing campaign for years, was a ruin. Model found himself commanding something that had the shape of an army group and almost none of the substance. The first request to surrender came quickly. American commanders not wanting a bloody urban battle through the Ruhr's dense industrial cities, a prospect that the experience of Aachen had made very unwelcome, sent a formal demand for capitulation to Army Group B's headquarters. Model refused. But his refusal came with a distinct quality that those around him noted. He did not argue that the position could be held. He did not offer plans for breakout or relief. He simply said he would not surrender. The professional language was still there. The staff orders, the daily command routine, the communications to OKW, but something had changed. His chief of staff and surviving senior officers later described a man who was still functioning, but who had privately accepted the outcome. What he could not accept was the act of surrender itself. There's a documented exchange, preserved in the post-war accounts of his staff, in which Model told the officers gathered around him in those final days that a field marshal simply does not surrender. He cited Friedrich Paulus, who had surrendered at Stalingrad in January 1943, explicitly and with contempt. Model and Paulus had been friends, genuinely close, by the standards of professional soldiers in the 1930s. Paulus's decision to lay down his arms, regardless of the circumstances, was something Model had never forgiven. The irony that he was now inside his own encirclement, in conditions at least as desperate, was not lost on his staff. It may not have been lost on Model either. He just drew the opposite conclusion from the same situation. He began, in the second week of April, to dissolve the pocket from within, in the only way he could allow himself. He issued orders permitting soldiers from the Ruhr industrial districts, who had families in the area, to seek release from military service and return home. He authorized the surrender of units that were too depleted or too far gone to fight any longer. He began systematically dismantling what remained of Army Group B as a coherent force without ever formally surrendering it. It was, in its way, a precise and caring thing to do, reducing the suffering of men who would have kept fighting on his order, and simultaneously a form of ethical evasion, allowing the institution to dissolve while he preserved his personal refusal to submit. By the 18th of April, the Ruhr Pocket had effectively ceased to exist as a military force. More than 317,000 German soldiers surrendered to American forces in those days, the largest single surrender of German troops on the Western Front. Soldiers dropped their weapons and walked toward American lines by the tens of thousands. General officers surrendered at divisional headquarters. Unit after unit, formation after formation, the army that had held the Hürtgen Forest and stopped the Allied autumn offensive dissolved into prisoner columns moving west. Model watched it happen. He gave no order. He would not give that particular order. He was left in the last days of April with a small group of staff officers moving through the forests south of the city of Duisburg, evading American patrols. No headquarters, no command, no remaining troops, just a field marshal, his aide, and the question of what came next. Chapter 14. The forest south of Duisburg, the 21st of April, 1945. There are very few sources for what happened in the final days, and I want to be clear about that. The primary account that exists comes from the sole surviving staff officer who stayed with Model to the end. His testimony was recorded after the war and forms the basis of what we know about those last hours. It's a single source for an intimate event. That means the details I can offer are not the product of cross-referenced archival material. They are what one man remembered, years later, about something he had witnessed in a forest in April 1945. On the 21st of April 1945, the day after Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, which Hitler spent in the ruins of Berlin, Walter Model walked into the forest between Duisburg and the village of Lintorf. He was 54 years old. He had commanded armies and army groups for 3 years. He had been wounded 3 times in the First World War and had survived the entire Eastern Front without a wound in the Second. He had, by any reasonable assessment, helped prolong a war that was consuming Germany and Europe. He had also, by any reasonable assessment, been one of the most technically proficient military commanders of the entire conflict. He held both of those things in his person simultaneously, and the archive doesn't let you separate them. He told his remaining staff that he didn't want to be captured, that he wouldn't be put on display, and that what he was about to do was what he considered his only remaining option. He had earlier cited in conversations with his officers both his contempt for the act of surrender and his awareness that he would likely face prosecution for crimes committed under his command. The deportations in Estonia, the anti-partisan operations on the Eastern Front, the conditions imposed on the civilian populations of the areas his armies had passed through. The documents connecting him to some of those decisions exist. The historians who have examined his record in detail, including Stein in the Critical Reassessment published in 2011, conclude that he would almost certainly have faced serious charges at Nuremberg. He shot himself. 1 shot to the head. The officer who was with him buried him in the forest. The grave was unmarked for years. His remains were eventually exhumed and identified in 1955 and reared in a German military cemetery. A ceremony that was itself controversial, as West German society was still struggling with how to handle the commemoration of officers who had served the Third Reich with distinction and complicity simultaneously. I've thought a lot about what the right thing to say about that moment is, and I keep arriving at the same answer. I don't think there is a right thing to say. He chose death over the accountability that capture would have brought. He cited the institution. A field marshal does not surrender, but the institution was gone. There was nothing left to serve. It was a deeply personal choice, dressed in professional language. Whether it was a form of moral cowardice or a final assertion of a certain kind of soldierly identity probably depends on what you believe those things mean. And I don't think the archive resolves it for you. His wife Herta survived the war. His son Hans-Georg served in the Bundeswehr, the post-war West German military, and reached the rank of Major General. The family carried the name forward into a Germany that had to find some way to assess what its generals had done and been and built. And that process of assessment is still ongoing in the academic literature. There's no settled verdict. There probably never will be. Chapter 15. The Reckoning, Legacy, Historiography, and what Model leaves behind Walter Model has been called, in various places in the literature, Hitler's best defensive general, the Third Reich's most reliable crisis manager, and, in a phrase I first came across in Little Hart's Reflections, the one German commander who genuinely frightened the Allied High Command in the second half of the war. He has also been called a war criminal, a fanatic, and a man whose military brilliance was inseparable from the ideological system it served. All of those descriptions are accurate. None of them is complete. That's the difficulty. And it's a difficulty that serious historians have been wrestling with since the 1950s without arriving at a consensus. The military case for Model's greatness is, in purely operational terms, overwhelming. Consider the record. He took command of a shattered position before Moscow in January 1942 and stabilized it. He took command of Army Group North in January 1944 and withdrew it to a prepared defensive line without losing it. He took command of Army Group Center in June 1944 after Bagration had destroyed the force and rebuilt a continuous front in weeks. He stopped Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the only major Allied strategic operation in the European theatre that failed completely. He conducted the Ardennes offensive, despite disagreeing with its concept, and came closer than anyone had a right to expect to achieving its initial objectives. Any one of those outcomes would have secured a historical reputation. Model achieved all of them consecutively in roughly 30 months. The counter case is equally documented. Model was a committed National Socialist, and not merely in the sense that a professionally ambitious officer might affiliate with the prevailing political order. He believed in the cause, or at least presented that belief, with a consistency that went beyond what professional advancement required. His orders on the Eastern Front show compliance with the worst directives of the German War of Extermination. The anti-partisan sweeps, the deportations, the destruction of villages, the civilian suffering imposed on populations that his armies passed through. He was not Manstein, attempting to construct a post-war defense that he was merely a professional soldier following orders at arm's length from ideology. Model never attempted that defense, partly because he killed himself before it could be tested, and partly because the operational record doesn't obviously support it anyway. Robert Forchex's biography, published in 2010, is the most serious, sustained attempt to assess the whole career. And Forchex's conclusion, roughly, is that Model was a genuinely gifted commander whose skills were deployed in service of a regime that made his gifts morally contaminated. That's the academic consensus as it currently stands. Though Stein's 2011 critical reassessment pushes harder on the question of complicity in specific atrocities and is less generous in its overall framing. The debate in the secondary literature isn't about whether Model was a capable officer. It's about whether capability in that context is something we can assess separately from what it was used for. I don't think it is. But I think pretending it didn't exist would be its own kind of dishonesty. What I find most human about Model, and I realize I've been circling this throughout the entire script, is the contrast between the institution and the person. The institution was obedience, commitment, the machinery of command working at maximum efficiency in service of a state. The person burned his papers. The person walked into a forest alone. The person never wrote the memoir, never gave the post-war interview, never offered the retrospective self-justification that other German commanders produced in quantity throughout the 1950s. Whether that silence was integrity or evasion, I genuinely can't tell you. Maybe it was both. His operational innovations outlasted him and outlasted the war. The Kampfgruppe, the all-arms, task-organized battle group that he used as his basic building block across every campaign from the Eastern Front to the Ruhr, became standard doctrine in multiple post-war armies, including NATO forces during the Cold War. The emphasis on a continuous front, rather than strong-point defense, the centralized control of artillery at divisional and corps level, the aggressive use of small mobile reserves to counterattack local penetrations before they became breakthroughs. These are all recognizable in Western and American military doctrine of the 1950s and 60s, arrived at partly by the same route that all military doctrine travels, by studying what worked for the enemy. There is one more thing I want to say before we close, and it comes from something very specific in the historical record. When the pocket was collapsing and the surrenders were beginning, an American officer reportedly sent a formal message to Model's headquarters stating that Model's performance in the Ruhr had been one of the finest defensive operations of the entire war, and that he had the personal respect of the American commanders facing him. I don't know exactly how Model received that message or whether he responded, but I find myself thinking about it. A man who had driven himself to the edge of everything, who had fought 6 consecutive crises on 2 fronts, and won more of them than anyone had any right to expect, receiving recognition from the army that had just destroyed his last command. The music teacher's son from Genthin. At the end, the history of the Second World War is full of men who did terrible things capably and capable things terribly. And Model sits among them, not as a villain or a hero, but as something more uncomfortable. A professional at the peak of his profession in service of a catastrophe. That is, I think, the most honest summary the record allows. And the record is what we have to work with. Everything else, the inner life, the private conviction, the final choice in the forest south of Duisburg, he took with him when he burned the papers. That's the story. 54 years, a world war and a half, from a classroom in Naumburg to a forest in the Ruhr. Thank you for spending this time with it.